computer.
Yeah. There's two. One more there.
Okay, everybody, I think we just have to get started. So, it's time for Jane to talk about fancy dress and the importance of the costumes you wear when doing reenactments. So I don't think I will spend more time on introduction, just...
Thank you very much. Well, it's always a good start when you have to put more chairs out for your talk. So thank you all very much for coming. And anyone who heard me speak in Malmö, which Stefan talked about this morning, please believe me when I say I have changed my clothes since a month ago. I just happen to have worn the same outfit. I started my journey in the world of costumed interpretation, reenactment, living history a long time ago in the 80s, and I did start my reenactment life as a Viking. I wasn't a very good Viking, and I moved very swiftly forward to the Wars of the Roses in the UK, and then to the early modern period, which is sort of where I got stuck. But I went from being an amateur reenactor, doing voluntary work, in all sorts of different historic settings, to being a professional costumed interpreter. And most particularly for 12 years, I managed the front of house costumed interpretation for the historic royal palaces in the UK. I was a contractor, so I worked as an independent organisation contracted to heritage organisations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things I did as a manager of costumed interpretation. But most particularly, I'm going to give you the benefit of some of the results from my research when I moved into studying recreations of the past for my PhD. Now, I come at this from two perspectives. One, and I would say probably the most important perspective for me, is the notion of the accurate reconstruction of historic dress. And I can do a whole other presentation on that, and indeed would be very happy to talk to anyone who's particularly passionate about this. I had an interesting conversation over lunch about the need for a model of good practice in the reconstruction of historic dress, which is something I'm interested in developing in a collaborative way. But the second and most important perspective for the purposes of this talk is my work into effective communication with visitors at historic sites, which some of you will no doubt have found yourself having to do as part and parcel of your hobby as reenactors, or indeed your passion in the recreation of the past. So I'm going to talk a bit about the evidence that I've used, my methodology in gathering it, what my main findings were, how I developed a benchmark for effective communication, and I'm going to talk about how I applied that in different heritage organisations in the UK. So just very briefly, my overview of work in the published literature on costume in the visitor experience tends to dwell upon the superficiality of dress as, if you like, set dressing in a heritage experience for visitors. And the word that comes up time and time again in the literature is the idea that somehow historic dress adds to the atmosphere of the visit. And maybe it adds to the atmosphere for you as reenactors or living historians. So the first thing that I would like to share with you is my understanding of the word authenticity, which has developed over time. We can't really use the word authenticity in relation to recreated historic dress because the accurate use of the word authenticity refers only to the original material. We cannot use it to mean something we've recreated because that is a misnomer. What we really talk about is verisimilitude. What we're trying to do is use a range of sources to recreate something which is similar to the dress of the past. So we can't use authentic as a, is it authentic? Is it unauthentic? This is not an appropriate use of the word. And again, I could talk at great length about this. And there are useful sources such as Elizabeth Wayland Barber, the textile archaeologist and anthropologist, who has written on this notion. And of course, we all know that the idea of accuracy and the use of sources is a troubled area of discussion, not least whether or not we can be objective about accuracy. However, leaving that aside, what's wonderful about the idea of working in reconstructed historic dress is it does this. It evokes the world of the past, whatever era you're working in. The dress itself can speak volumes about these topic areas, how people spent their money, to what extent what they earned went on their wardrobe. What does their dress say about their life cycle, their personal biography? And what sorts of possessions are there that we all share today and people had in the past that we wear on our bodies or carry with us? And most importantly for me, good, historic and well-interpreted dress allows us to talk about the intangibles of the past. And we don't always want to be bogged down in what we can do with our hands and see with our eyes. Sometimes history teaches us more about attitudes and how we can make the world a better place in the future. So dress, I see, as a dialogue with the visitor at historic sites. All these topics are ripe for discussion with visitors if you use the dress as an entryway into them. And dress is a very easy door to walk through to get into these complex and sometimes troubling topics. So this is an example taken from a book on historic dress, which didn't really intend to work with how dress talks to the visitor. But you can map all kinds of different aspects of life in the past onto a specific garment, and in this case, a mantua from about the year 1700. This is just one chain of ideas, and if the piece of paper was bigger, we could probably make the chains of thinking bigger too. But dress can also be problematic, and people often say, oh, but it's very uncomfortable when you meet someone dressed in the clothing of the past. Visitors don't feel comfortable about talking to them. Or the staff wearing them might feel silly, which of course is not something that any of you would understand. You're all very comfortable wearing these clothes, as indeed am I. As I mentioned before, it can be seen as a superficial decoration, just a titivation of the experience for visitors. And of course, all too often, what the interpreters are wearing may be fancy dress, not real clothing that a person in the past would have worn day in, day out. And worst of all, for me, is the criticism that somehow putting people in costume makes it into a trivialization of history, which I don't think is ever true. So what did I look at? Well, I did a series of surveys and investigations. Does anybody have some water? Because I can feel that my throat is about to... Super, thank you very much. I didn't expect such a big audience, and you're all taking the air. No, you're very welcome. I will happily share my oxygen with you. Excuse me. So I did an initial costumed interpretation survey among sites around the world that use permanent costumed interpreters who are paid for doing the job. I undertook detailed correspondence with some of the sites who responded, and I was able to examine job descriptions for costumed interpreters and look at how they manage the costume resources they use. And I also looked at contracts and guidelines for how the staff work in costume. Excuse me, and what I discovered was that most see costumed interpretation as a means to add educational benefit to the experience for visitors. And that really then informed the rest of my work. So how and why is costume used? I was sent lots of information from people who are at the sharp end of using reconstructed historic dress in the visitor experience about the practical demands and difficulties, which I'm sure many of you are very aware of. And these were the main things that came up as being problematic. The need for funding, the recognition that good reconstructed historic dress costs money, the difficulty of policing anachronisms, which I'm sure is something you've all wrestled with, and indeed what is an anachronism, how you evaluate the staff in their costumes, and how do you maintain them to make sure that they are good quality. And what about training people to wear the clothes as well as dealing with their attitudes about wearing them? And one of the things that I found was that it was really difficult for any of these sites to measure and prove the effectiveness of training to wear historic dress, and indeed use it as an interpretive tool in the visitor experience. And it's very hard if you're not able to measure the effectiveness of training to then help people do it better. And I've put here that the evidence suggests staff are an important part of the heritage experience, but my argument would be that many of the findings I came to are equally applicable to people who are volunteering to work in historic environments using costumed interpretation as a hobby. So I then went on and did a much more detailed study to try and measure the visitor experience and the role of costumed interpretation in it. And I was able to develop what my supervisor always referred to as my research instrument, which I always thought sounded a bit surgical, and build a representative sample of 12 sites in different countries, Sweden, Canada, the US, and the UK. And the measures of the visitor experience that I pulled from previous investigations of what visitors want and enjoy at historic sites were these 5 dimensions: value for money, helpfulness, fun, learning, and a sense of the past, which might indeed be atmosphere, which I mentioned at the beginning. So I arranged the sites I was working with according to 3 variables, and the thing I'm most interested in here is training people for work with the public. I also looked at the variable of how much people were paid, and also how much money was put into the reconstruction of historic dress for them to wear. And I divided them into high, medium, and low category sites according to the levels of investment across those 3 variables. My research instrument was a questionnaire which used the paired comparisons technique for getting people's responses to the costumed interpreters. And I used gap analysis by analysing what people felt they wanted from the experience versus what they felt they gained. So if anybody is a statistics nerd and wants to talk to me about that, that's another thing I like talking about at great length. So warning, here come the graphs, but I will hold your hands as we walk through them. What you see here is what my research with 600 visitors showed visitors wanted across the whole 12 sample sites. The blue line represents visitors' requirements for a good visit. And you can see that learning is their highest priority. Now, value for money is at the bottom, but that's not to say it was unimportant. It just means in these 5 measures, it was the least important. And you can see that helpfulness, having fun, and feeling a sense of atmosphere are in the middle. Overall, the costumed interpreters, it appears, were very helpful. They weren't much fun. They did lend atmosphere, and they felt short in terms of visitors' learning requirements, but only just. So what happens then when we look at the sites where the interpreters were given a very high training regime? And again, this is relative. They were the highest in terms of the investment in training out of the sample I looked at. And what we see, the blue line once again is what visitors overall require. The yellow line is what the visitors at those particular sites said they wanted, and the red line is what the visitors felt the costumed interpreters contributed. And you can see that where training has been provided in how to work with the visitors, the learning outstrips what visitors want. Fun has gone above the general level at which visitors identify their requirements. And helpfulness too has scored well. So training is clearly something that adds value to the visitor experience in terms of contact with costumed interpreters. So what about investment in the actual costume? Well, here we see, once again, the blue line is the visitors' priorities across all the sites. The yellow line is their priorities at these particular sites. And the red line shows us what the visitors thought the costumed interpreters contributed to their visit. This time, although the learning quotient has outstripped the general level of requirement for learning, it's fallen short at these particular sites. And fun, unfortunately, has plummeted again. So a high investment in costume alone is not necessarily going to be the thing that makes a visitor experience satisfying for the visitors. However, what we have learnt from this initial part of the research is that training leads to learning. So if you feel when you're working in a historic site that you want to buy into their mission to educate the public, then some form of training to work with the public is a valuable investment. Unfortunately, though, across the sites that I investigated as a whole, nearly all of them invested too little in training interpreters. And here I see an opportunity for people who are not professional interpreters. Maybe you can do their jobs better if it's something that you feel you want to do. And 64% of sites invest too little in the costume. And there again, perhaps the world of reenactment does a better job. So my recommendations would be that training should be provided for people who are going to work in costume with the public, and that it's better to have fewer really good costumes than to have lots of cheaper, less accurate, less valuable costumes. I'm just going to very briefly, because I know this is something very contentious in the world of reenactment as well as in professional interpretation, talk about first person versus third person, which I also measured. First person, as most of you I'm sure know, is about staying in role, playing a character, never coming out of role. Third person is introducing yourself as yourself, but dressed in a costume that might represent an actual person or an amalgam of people. And then some places have both first and third person interpreters on site. Some places have interpreters that play both first and third person interpretation. Sometimes they're doing craft demonstrations and sometimes they're not. And sometimes there are other staff who help interpret what the first person interpreters are trying to say while they're trying to do a craft and explain it to the visitors. But what I have to say, and one of my most important messages is, we talk about this stuff, but the visitors never use these words. The visitors just don't think like this. They meet a person in a costume who was interesting or entertaining or fun to be with or who really opened their minds. So what can we learn then if we look at what visitors say they learnt from costumed interpreters who happen to be doing first person versus third person interpretation? And before I go through these results in detail, I will admit it, I changed my mind. When I started out as a professional costumed interpreter, having been a volunteer reenactor, doing role play and resolute role play, I was convinced that was the way forward. But my research told me otherwise. So I have walked across to the other side of the church. And now I do something different, which I will now explain. So the first person interpreters, you can see here, tended not to hit the button when it came to learning, although they did tend to be perceived as adding fun to visitors' experiences. Overall, third-person interpreters, I'm afraid, are really not much fun. And they also don't really hit the button on learning. In this particular instance, they just about hit it for visitors as a whole. And they did outstrip what the visitors at these particular sites wanted in terms of learning. But it's nothing like as impressive as what they added in terms of atmosphere. But what happens when you do first and third person? When you actually come in and out of role? Well, everything looks a lot more healthy in the learning department. It's still good in terms of conveying atmosphere, and fun has improved quite considerably. And the interpreters are perceived as considerably helpful, which is always a good thing. So I applied this method to costumed interpreters working, and some of them were reenactment societies and some of them were professional, working for Historic Scotland. And what they wanted was to gather information about how best to do special events for the public so that they would learn from the past. Now, this is a stock photograph, and these are not the actual interpreters I was studying. They're here for the purposes of illustration to show that Historic Scotland draw on a lot of different groups to present their history to the past. But I divided the teams I was studying into A, B, and C, partly to preserve anonymity. And I looked at 7 sites on weekend days and weekends in July and August. I was accompanied by a qualitative researcher. So there are some qualitative findings as well as the quantitative findings. So the qualitative findings were these, and I think some of these might stand to reason, and you know this from your experience, that they bring sites to life, they give a sense of the past, they're often enjoyable and entertaining. They prompted memories of Scots history, and they're good at introducing specific topics and adding depth to visitors' understandings of the past. But on the other side, visitors said that they tended to suffer from a bias towards military and warlike themes. Sorry about that. There was adverse comment from women and children. A lot of the presentations were not seen as suitable for younger children, and often they required seating for visitors, and that's because a lot of the presentations were theatrical in the way they were presented. So what we find is that the visitors going to these sites in Scotland tended to be what I call fact finders. So these are the people who prioritise learning. And right at the bottom were the people who prioritised value for money, and they're the people I call the penny pinchers. But in between are the fun lovers and the help seekers and the past searchers, the people who want to feel they're having an immersive experience in the way that we were hearing about this morning some people do in reenactment. So my graphs weren't quite so fancy in those days. This is the overall result that we see. All the interpreters at all the sites I studied. There's plenty of atmosphere being provided. There's not enough fun, and there's not enough learning or helpfulness. Team A, they gave a great deal of atmosphere. They were really not very helpful. They were no fun, and they didn't hit learning. So not a good result there. Oops, I went the wrong way, sorry. Team B, really not very helpful at all. They gave a lot of sense of the past, and they were much more fun to be with, but they didn't hit the button on the learning. And Team C, they were much, much more successful. Let me ask you, from what I told you before, what do you think Team C were doing in terms of how they interacted with the visitors? They were mixing first and third person interpretation. They were sliding in and out of character according to what the visitor in front of them required from them. So I know, because I've done it, that first person interpretation can disappear up its own artifice. And I therefore do not recommend it as a way of satisfying all visitors all the time. It's much better to have a well-developed character who you can be and role play with the visitors who understand that game. And then when somebody says, but how do you know that? You can say, well, there's a very interesting article in Archaeology Today in 1989 that tells us that shoes looked like this. You know, there's a real need to be able to slide in and out of character to serve all visitors well. And Team C were the team of interpreters who did that, whereas Team B were mostly third-person interpreters, and Team A were mostly first-person interpreters. So this is statistically significant information in that I questioned a lot of visitors. Overall, I think it's very useful in helping us make decisions about where to put our resources in terms of how we do costumed interpretation. So I feel that by doing this benchmarking exercise, it's been possible to show the effectiveness of costumed interpretation. It's a way of diagnosing whether or not the costumed interpreters are hitting the mark in terms of what the site wants to contribute for visitors' experience at their sites. And it's a fairly swift and sophisticated benchmark for how people are serving the visitors in a heritage site. So I would say, from my experience of doing this and researching it, that it's a good idea to adopt a well-defined character which is based on sound research into real people as far as possible. That interpreters shouldn't adopt strict first-person interpretation, but they should work in and out of character to serve visitors' specific needs. And I introduced this at Hampton Court Palace, where I was working when my results came to light. And I called it persona interpretation. And I think of it very much like the wonderful graph we saw this morning, or representation we saw this morning, of the LARP mixing desk. I see an interpreter working like a mixing desk, that you have your first-person interpretation full volume over here, and then you have your, I know what I'm talking about, third-person interpreter who did a bit of research person over here, and you kind of blend those tracks together, along with other things like being able to tell people where the toilets are. So that's just a quick insight into the work I've done into the role of costumed interpretation in the visitor experience. And I'm very, very happy to have had the opportunity to share this work with you, because as far as I know, I'm the only person to have done any empirical work on the effectiveness of costumed interpretation in the visitor experience. So go forth and crusade.
Thank you very much.
There's a question.
Yeah, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So.
I have a short question. The reaction patterns of the visitors, do you suspect them to be the same in England, France, Italy, and Scandinavia, or US? Or are they?
I actually analysed my results across the 4 countries that I did the work in. So there was Sweden, the US, Canada, and the UK. And the thing that at the time struck me was Canada, Parks Canada in particular at that time, were putting a great deal more money and thought into their costumed interpretation programme. And it really showed. So if I was to show you the graphs of the countries, Canada's would be higher than everybody else's on pretty much every measure. Since then, Parks Canada has completely broken up their costumed interpretation programme team. And so it's now each site does its own thing again. And I think that was a really sad retrogressive step. But in terms of your question about visitor reaction, I was very happy to see that the work I did in Scotland replicated the same pattern as I saw in Sweden, the US, Canada, and the UK. So while I'm loath to say we're the same the world over, we're the same the world over.
I also have a question. I used to work as a third-person impersonator, but the funding was gone.
Yeah.
Subsidies are gone. It was the nice crisis thing, and I see also a bad history going now for the UK as well. I mean, if all the money goes away, then we are the first that get kicked out.
Yeah.
And that's a very pity thing. And I'm very happy you did the research, so we can sort of them and all those managers to make things efficient.
Yeah.
You say, like, here we have a research. So do you spread the researches out to museums?
I do try. I have to be honest, when I did my PhD and I was working for the Historic Royal Palaces, I was in the position to tell them, look, this is what my research has shown. And it was just so disheartening that, because I had to tender for the contract every 3 to 5 years, and money was always a big issue, the palace management actually decided to run in totally the opposite direction to what my research suggested. So they wanted much more theatrical, spectacular presentations where you don't interact with the visitor. And, you know, my joy in doing this is interacting with the visitor. And I believe it's much better to take people who know their history and teach them how to communicate than it is to take actors and try and teach them about history. I mean, no disrespect to any actors in the room, but being an actor is a very different job from being a costumed interpreter, in my view. And so that's why ultimately I don't work for the Historic Royal Palaces anymore, because I felt that the direction of travel was in interaction with visitors. And also I became much more interested in the lack of resources available for people who want to reconstruct historic dress. And that's why I wrote the Tudor Tailor with Nina Mikhaila, because we wanted to put a lot of the evidence that's available for early modern dress in an easy, accessible form. And this is where I support what was said this morning. We need more conduits by which scholarly work on dress and textiles and accessories can get through to the people who want it in accessible, enjoyable ways. And that's something I've campaigned for really strongly in my work at the Centre for Textile Research here in Copenhagen.